good people. Sorry I was a little late. My computer was a little glitchy. Right now I'm here all by myself. This is a true test here of who really wants to review for their exam. It is still spring break, for heaven's sakes. And the answer is two. Two people. Four! Oh my god, look at that. Four. Very impressive. I'll be the first to admit I'm not that excited to be here. And I'm sure you're not either. But we will be glad. This is important, and it's not going to get easier as the week gets underway next week. So we'll be glad that we took some time to do this now as we prepare for the exam on the 6th, which, it is getting close. So tonight I wanted to review, and we'll just review for as long as you have questions, okay? I wanted to review Unit 2. So let's remind ourselves what Unit 2 is about. Remember, I organize things a little differently than maybe the College Board or review text, but today we want to talk about Congress, the House and the Senate, the presidency, and the budget process, okay? And then I also want to talk about FRQ 2. This is posted on Google Classroom, and also I sent it via Remind. So while y'all are thinking about or looking over your Unit 2 stuff, or thinking about the presidency and Congress and those things, I'm going to go ahead and talk about FRQ 2. And then maybe as you have questions, you can put them in the chat box and I will address them then. All right, so FRQ 2 is what we call the quantitative simulation, or stimulus, okay, the quantitative stimulus. So they're going to give you a chart or a graph or a map or something visual. It could also be a political cartoon. And it's a 4-point question. Okay, a 4-point question. The first part, which we'll call A, is to identify or describe the data presented. Okay, and you're going to name a principle, a process, an institution, a characteristic in the data, okay? And it's a phenomenon and its most significant characteristics. And descriptions most often address what questions. To me, this is the most just tell me what the graphic is communicating. Something it is clearly communicating. So to me, point 1 is just honestly making sure that they know you can read the graph or the chart. And you need to, do not use pronouns and state in very precise language what it is that the graph is telling you or the map, okay? Then you describe a similarity or difference in the stimulus and you have to draw a conclusion about it, okay? So you have to notice a difference and then propose or draw a conclusion about it. Okay, so like the last one we did together in class this semester is they showed voter ID laws and how stringent they are across the United States. And so the first thing you have to do is just make it clear that you see laws across the United States. The first point. Then you have to draw a conclusion about how in certain regions of the country, the laws are much more strict than in other parts of the country, and draw a conclusion about that, okay? And elaborate on the larger meaning of the data and why it matters and how it relates to political questions, okay? And then you have to explain how something is impacted or demonstrates a principle we've learned in the class, okay? So in the example we looked at in class, it was like, well, how does this graphic represent federalism? And you needed to say, well, because federalism means that the states have their own authority and can exercise it. And since they have come up with different voting laws, that demonstrates the idea that the states have authority separate from the feds. So you're going to connect the graphic. You're going to look for trends, and then you're going to posits possible causation for those trends or conclusions about those trends. And then you're going to connect those trends to a principle we have studied in the class. And when you do that, you want to be sure you explain what the principle is. Okay. And so the principle, we've studied so many principles in the class. So it could really be anything, but that's going to be the pattern you're going to see in the question. State what you see. Describe a similarity or difference. That's the second point. Draw a conclusion. Connect that to a principle we've studied in class. 4-point question. Okay? And then, of course, be sure your answer is clear. Don't use pronouns. Use precise, specific language. And use present tense verbs. Okay, so that is FRQ, quantitative. Okay, so do we have any questions about Congress, the president, or the budget process? Anything you want me to talk through? If anything, I think that this process just makes us kind of like refocus on those subjects that we haven't thought about in a while. Great. Thank you, Taylor, for reminding me you are not Eric. Okay. So Taylor wants to be reminded about pork barrel and earmarks. Okay. And actually, these are two words for the same idea. Okay. Kind of a positive connotation, negative connotation is earmarks. Pork barrel is a more negative connotation. So what it basically means is within a law, earmark, let's start with earmark. Within a law, a bill can be multi-pages, many pages long, kind of like a small book. If within the bill is some project or benefit that is going to a specific district or state, and can be found because it's such a specific thing on a specific page of the bill, like on page 63, there's this earmark. What that means is you can turn down the page of the bill and find that there. And it's a small project that's slated for a specific district. So it would be covered in a relatively small place in the bill on a specific page. So you can earmark, turn down the page, and kind of a district representative or a senator from that state can kind of like remember that they're going to get something good on that page for their home state or their district. Okay. And bringing home the bacon is kind of an idea behind here. I don't know why there's all these pig references about this, but other than the fact of who doesn't love bacon, right? And who doesn't love a project that your elected representative has gotten passed that's going to come to your state or your district and bring construction money, a benefit, jobs, something to the people, right? And so earmarks and pork barrels are that. So it's a portion of a bill that brings a specific benefit to a singular district or state. And therefore, the elected person can kind of come home and do credit claiming about that, right? Like I brought, Tom Tillis just did this with the Veterans Hospital in North Carolina, and he'll be able to credit claim about that when he runs for president. Okay. Now, in the past, we've looked at pork barrel and earmarks as wasteful government spending that brings unneeded projects to specific states, and it brings a lot of fat to the budget and those things. Now, there was a time where it was proposed that like the president could just line item out all the earmarks, and they gave President Clinton, for example, the line item veto. We know now that the Supreme Court has declared that unconstitutional, and that if we want to give a line item veto to the president, that we have to pass an amendment about it. Ha ha. So But other people see these as like a positive thing, because one way you can get people to compromise is if they need a little sweetener or something to get them to support a bill, you can throw in an earmark for their district, and that's how you could get to 60 votes in the Senate to break the filibuster to actually make something happen and break the gridlock. Okay. So, in a time period right now where we have a lot of gridlock in Washington, some people are saying we should bring back the pork. Might waste a little money, but might actually get the government moving. Okay. Stare decisis. Huh. I'm happy to answer that. That's actually about the judiciary branch, which is the next unit, which we're talking about tomorrow at 3 p.m., by the way. Stare decisis is just the idea that the courts look at a case. Usually this is at the appellate jurisdiction, and they're looking at a case from a lower court, and they decide after hearing the case or looking over it that the original lower court decision should stand. Let the decision stand. In Latin is some stare decisis. Okay, so that's what stare decisis is. Okay, thank you, Mary, about tax expenditures and loopholes. So, tax expenditures and loopholes are the same thing. Kind of like earmarks and pork barrels. It's just different ways of stating the thing. Okay, so the government is supposed to be expecting all of this income tax revenue that ever since the 16th Amendment was passed around 1913 actually. The government is like owed all this money from income taxes, right? But over time they've decided to try and shape Americans' behavior by giving them loopholes where they can keep some of their income tax money that otherwise would go to the government, either to give them a mortgage deduction or a child credit so that they'll have children, or they'll buy homes, or they'll do these other activities that the government wants to encourage. So that is a loophole that they've created, that you don't have to actually pay taxes on all your income through these loopholes. Charitable deductions is another one. Well, if they don't have you send all your income tax money to them and instead they let you keep some, technically the other side of that is it's a tax expenditure on the part of the government. They have spent some of their tax money before they even got it by letting you keep it. Okay, so tax loopholes are tax expenditures. Okay, and they basically forego an opportunity for the government to bring in revenue. Okay, all right. Can you review the congressional? Okay, so there's all these agencies that the Congress has. The most important ones that the Congress have are these three: the Congressional Research Service, the CRS, and they are just the people who research whatever legislators need them to research to get more information to make more enlightened and well-crafted policy. Okay, so they're just like the research team for Congress, which I think is totally cool, and I kind of like to be on that. But so that's the Congressional Research Service, the CRS. Then you have the GAO, the Government Accounting Office. That's another agency of the Congress that's separate from any committees or any of those things. They are just kind of like a congressional oversight body that makes sure that all the agencies of the government are spending their money the way they're supposed to do. I sometimes think of it, instead of the General Accounting Office, as the General Auditing Office, because they audit the whole government and make sure that everyone is spending money the way it's supposed to be spent. Okay. And then the third thing is the Congressional Budget Office. Okay. And they're the third overarching agency. And they make sure that whatever bills are being proposed, that they predict what the outcomes of them are going to be, like how much that's really going to cost, or how many people will get health insurance if we pass this bill, how many people will lose health insurance. It's called scoring the bill. And they're supposed to be nonpartisan and the most neutral body, because obviously elected officials who want a bill might like rosy up the numbers and make them look better than they actually are. And loyal opposition and the minority party might run down a bill and say that it's not going to do what the majority says it's going to do. And so the CBO is supposed to come in and say, well, we've, in a bipartisan, neutral competence way that are typical of bureaucrats, we have scored the bill, and here's what we are predicting the outcome of the bill would be: how much it would cost, how much it would save, all of those things. All right, the different executive offices. Whew. the executive branch really is a little bit crazy, I'll admit. So let's just see if we can organize it in a couple different ways, and then Logan, I'll get to you. So there's all these agencies, right? And to some degree, they have congressional oversight by Congress, but also they're directly overseen by the executive branch, who appoints the heads of these agencies. So you have like this National Security Council, which is a part of the executive branch that advises the president about peace and war. Okay. And what's interesting about the National Security Council is actually the composition of it has changed. It kind of is up to the president to decide who they want to be in the National Security Council, but it has typically been the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Vice President. Those are kind of standing, and then representatives of the military, for sure. All right, so then we have the OMB. Let's talk about it next. That's the Office of Management and Budget. They're the ones who propose the president's budget, which typically is put out every end of January, early February mainly. And they just articulate, if the president could write a budget all by themselves, what would the budget be? And they send that to Congress as kind of an outline of the president's priorities related to budgetary matters. The COE, let me think, of Economic Advisors, the committee. I'm not sure what the COE is. It just doesn't look that familiar to me. The Council of Economic Advisors is what I'm thinking. And so these are the Council of Economic Advisors, if that's in fact what it is. They obviously just advise the president about the state of the economy. They interpret reports about how the economy is doing, those kinds of things, report to the president. So don't forget how the executive branch is kind of organized. So you have these general agencies that help administer and advise the president, administer the government, advise the president. Then you have these regulatory agencies, okay? And these regulatory agencies are like the Federal Communications Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agencies, that actually try and regulate business or oversee parts of society. And they have a regulatory function. And remember that those are different. The president actually cannot remove the heads of those agencies without just cause, theoretically. Okay. The Federal Reserve is another example of those. Okay. And that's we're a little squeamish about like what just cause has to be, especially lately with Donald Trump and Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve. But those are regulatory agencies. Then we have government corporations. Okay. These are services provided by the government that could be done by a private agency, but maybe they wouldn't do it with that it was geographically available across the whole country to even rural areas. And those are things like the post office is the most famous example, as well as Amtrak, or our train apparatus that serves the country. Also, I think Comstat is under that, who launches our satellites. They're an example of, or at least rents satellite space to corporations. That's an example of government corporations. So regulatory agencies, government corporations. We also have like independent agencies that are kind of the most weird ones, like NASA is an independent agency. And they're kind of very specific things that have been established to solve very specific problems in government that are kind of unrelated to anything else. They're not a government corporation. They're not a regulatory agency. Then we also have just kind of like your General Services Administration that oversees they're kind of what we call the administrative apparatus of the executive branch. Services Administration, which oversees like the cleaning and stocking of federal buildings. We also have like the Office of Personnel Management that does all the hiring for the federal government. And so those are some other kind of executive agencies. So I think, let me make sure I've covered all of it. I think that all of what I've just said is actually pretty, like, you don't need to know them all, and it can be really confusing. So, yeah, it was the Council of Economic Advisors. That's the executive office. Yeah, don't forget there's the whole White House staff. There's over like 200 people that just work directly in the Oval Office with the White House. Yeah, I think that everything else I've just talked about actually isn't that related to the president. It's more related to the bureaucracy. So I've done a little preview there in terms of how the bureaucracy is set up. I don't think it's going to hurt you, but you may not see it directly there on your review sheet under the presidency, at least. Okay, so Logan, you want to talk about Graham Redmond Hollings. So we know that when President Reagan took office, he cut taxes across the board, the highest tax cut we've had in American history. And he was supposed to cut spending, but that didn't really happen because we upped our national defense spending. And it's hard to cut entitlements on old people, Social Security and Medicare. So the cuts in spending didn't really happen, and the tax cuts went into effect, and we started running a very significant deficit that was accumulating over time to a rather sizable debt, which was not our custom. So by the 1980s and late 90s, the early 90s, there was this, late 80s especially, there was this idea that we needed to do something about the runaway debt. And one idea was this Graham Redmond Hollings Act. And what it basically said is if we didn't stop the spread of government, that we would have sequestration, which meant across the board cuts of indiscriminate cuts across every government department and agency. And that the threat of that would be so severe because it would be so inefficient and such a bad idea that it would make us get our financial house in order. Because sequestration is like, if I needed to lose weight, ideally I would do something targeted, right? Like I would focus on the parts that needed reducing, not just like cut off my head as a means of losing weight, right? Because my head does weigh a good, number of pounds. I wonder how much my head does weigh. But that'd be a dumb way to lose weight, right? Well, that's what sequestration is like. It's a dumb way to cut the government because you just indiscriminately cut all the departments across the board. Though some departments might serve an essential function, and other departments might be less important, and maybe the whole department should just disappear if you really wanted to be like sophisticated about it or even rational about it. But Graham Redmond Hollings really didn't ultimately succeed. It was, we actually went through sequestration a couple times. It didn't seem to have the effect that we were seeking. It was unpopular. So that's when in the 90s, when Clinton took over, we started the pay-as-you-go idea, which was that if you're going to increase domestic spending in the same bill, you had to explain how you were going to cut something to pay for it. That was the next idea for how we could try and bring some balance or fiscal responsibility to our budget. Okay, we know that all of those tricks to some degree haven't worked because now we're looking at a $22 trillion debt. Oh, that's a great question, William. Signing statements. We did not cover that well in class, if at all. So recently, this is an example of kind of informal constitutional amendment. Recently, this was especially big in the Bush administration, George W. Bush. I'm sure it existed before, but not to this extent. The president has, over time, it has evolved that if the president wants to make a little media splash, they can have a signing party where when they're signing important legislation, they have a moment where they invite people in and they might have like multiple pins and all these important people standing behind them. And they say a few words about the bill and then they sign it. And each letter the president sometimes writes, he hands off the pen to a very important person behind him who has some role in bringing this legislation into existence. It's like a feel-good moment, usually a way to like highlight the president's achievements and make everyone feel special. Okay. Well, a signing statement is at that time or soon thereafter, can be in writing or even orally, where the president says, you know what, I'm signing this law and it's up to me to decide how to actualize it, like execute this law as the executive branch, and it's my job to execute the laws. So here's how I am going to execute this law. Here's what I think it says, what it doesn't say, and what I'm going to do with it. And sometimes it can be kind of controversial. Like, it's clear that the president is like taking the spirit of the law and going to execute it in some other way than maybe there's widespread consensus about how it should be done. Okay, so it's just a little way of the president kind of declaring his guiding principles or vision for a bill. And yeah, so it's kind of a new thing and can give you some insights into the president's thinking that we haven't always had before. Okay, it used to be that we had to like wait for the president to act, and then we would know how they were going to execute the law. Now the president can kind of give a little heads up, and a lot can be read into that. And, and it says nowhere in the Constitution the president must do this. It doesn't say they can't do this. It's just kind of up to the president's judgment as to whether they want to issue a signing statement or make a signing statement, and if they think it will serve their purposes or overall agenda. All right. Other questions? You know what electoral mandates are? It's an important question. Egalitarian. Okay. It's a good question. Egalitarian typically means that everyone within an institution has the same amount of power. Okay, so we've moved from marriages that were male dominated to egalitarian, which means that women and men, or men and men, or women and women, I guess, in this modern age, that the people within that institution, they have a similar amount of power and one doesn't dominate the other. Okay, and so the Senate is more egalitarian than the House because each person has a similar amount of power. One of the major reasons why is that they have open debate on the floor of the Senate, which means that anyone, whether they've been there 5 minutes or 50 years, can offer an amendment to a bill. So they have equal access to that power. And that's why the Senate is very egalitarian. Okay. In the House, they have the Rules Committee, and the Rules Committee shapes debate, and very rarely do they have open debate. In fact, most of the work to craft bills in the House has to be done in committee. And by the time the committee sends the bill to the floor of the House, there's very few changes that can be made to the bill. And if there are changes that are going to be entertained, everyone doesn't have equal access to how they can participate in that process. So the House is less egalitarian because the longer you've been there, due to seniority, a lot more power you have, and the Rules Committee strictly controls the debate. Because it's 435 people, you have to have a certain degree of order imposed from above, because 435 people can't really have a conversation. But 100 people can if they use parliamentary procedure and an open debate. So that's why the Senate is more egalitarian. All right. Any other questions? Okay. Decentralization and polarization in Congress. Let's talk about polarization first, and then I'll come back to decentralization. So, polarization is when we have the political spectrum, right? Let me see if I can do this from your point of view. Well, just do it with your hands, okay? Because I can only do it with my hands. So we have the right, which is conservatives, which are Republicans, and we have the left, which is liberals, Democrats. And in the middle, we have the moderates, right? And theoretically, in a winner-take-all system where you either win the election or you get nothing, the idea is that you want to win. And so we tend to have two parties. The winner-take-all system tends to make us have two parties only because somebody has to get 51% of the vote, and that's very hard to do. If you have four parties, everyone only gets 25% of the vote, and then you throw the House, they're talking about the election for the presidency, you throw the election into the House of Representatives, which is not very democratic. So we tend to have two parties, and those two parties tend to want to move to the middle and get swing voters to win 51% of the electoral votes in the Electoral College. So you would think that our elected leaders would tend to be moderate, okay, and go towards the middle. The problem is that we have been, after the census has been conducted, we've been drawing our districts in an increasingly gerrymandered way. This is particularly true of the House, more so than the Senate, because the House depends upon the drawing of districts to determine representatives. So, as those representatives now are in gerrymandered districts, they have very little competition from the other party, so they do not have to be moderate. In fact, in order to win the election, they need to be hyper partisan because the districts are drawn Republican or Democrat in general. They stack and crack the districts so that a particular party will dominate that district. So suddenly we have people showing up in Congress who are like hyper Republican if their district is hyper Republican, or hyper liberal if their district is drawn liberal, and they're polarized. They don't have any incentive to work together or meet in the middle to compromise, and that polarization is what that is called. Okay, and so we've seen the breakdown of compromise. We've seen gridlock, increasing like hyper partisan posturing, but not a whole lot of like legislating, because very rarely can the two sides get together. Polarization exists, but is a little less extreme in the Senate because those people have to win statewide races, and in super conservative states, that means that the senators are still hyper partisan. But in swing states, we see a more moderate senator have to show up because he has to try and get votes from both sides. So the House is more polarized than the Senate, but polarization in general is an issue with hyperpartisanship in American politics right now. All right, I'm thinking about decentralization, and maybe I should look at the review sheet and see where this is mentioned and in what context sometimes. So one idea I have about decentralization is that they've restructured the committee chair system, and they've made seniority less important, and they've put term limits on how long you can be the chair. And so that has decentralized the leadership of, oh, I don't see that decentralization and polarization. And so they've made the committee leadership a little more decentralized, and it's less likely that a few individuals will just dominate the committees and the House or the Senate. Okay, so the decline of seniority and the limiting of the power of committee chairs, I would say, is probably what we're getting at there with decentralization. Okay, so committees. Thank you, Emmy. So the differences between standing, joint, and conference and select. Okay, so the easiest one is standing committees. Okay, standing committees, and you don't have to memorize all the committees, for heaven's sakes. Okay? Just know that standing committees are the committees that just always exist to do the basic business of the House and the Senate. Okay, so take the Judiciary Committee of the Senate. They have advise and consent power. The House does not. Through their advise and consent power, they have to approve judges. And so they have a Judiciary Committee that does that work, and it's just a standing committee. They always have it because there's always going to need to be a need to approve judges at the district, Court of Appeals, and Supreme Court level. Same with the House. The House has a Ways and Means Committee. It's basically kind of pulls together budgeting, since the House is the one House of Congress where all revenue bills must start. Okay. They know that they're going to have to deal with a lot related to revenue, taxing, those things. So they have a standing committee to do that work. All right. So those just are committees that always have been, at least for a very long time, and for all intents and purposes going forward, we would expect they would continue to exist. Then you have joint committees. Joint committees are formed when the Senate and the House want to work on something together. It could be a joint committee on health reform. It could be a joint committee on anything. Typically, those joint committees are, they can go on for years, especially if there's an issue that is kind of an ongoing thing that they want to focus on. But they typically are topical in their structure, meaning they're about a specific thing. Conference committees are when the House has passed a bill about something and the Senate has passed a different bill, a different version of a bill about that same something, but there's differences. So remember that a House bill that goes to the Senate, there's open debate there. So the Senate can offer a whole bunch of amendments, and some amendments might get passed. And so then what you have is a House and Senate bill that are kind of different, but the same. So they have to go to a conference committee, and they send representatives from both bodies to the conference committee to iron out a compromise bill. And then that conference committee bill goes back to both houses to be voted on. So that's a conference committee. And then you have select committees. Select committees are very topically based, where it's basically like we need to form a special committee to look into this thing that we're very concerned about. Example was the most recent select committee I can think about was about Benghazi, and one of our ambassadors was killed in Libya, and there was a huge investigation as to what happened. So that's what a select committee is. And select or special committees just kind of pop up and then they disappear when they've reached some conclusion about that. So those are all, but you don't need to know how many specific committees each house has or what the names of all the committees are. Okay, that would be a little overwhelming. Okay, so executive orders. Great question. Okay, so executive orders are another one of those kind of informal powers of the presidency. They are not in the Constitution. Okay, an executive order is when the president basically directs the bureaucracy or some aspect of the government about how they're going to do something. Okay, how they're going to carry something out. And so here's a famous example of an executive order. They couldn't reach immigration reform during the Obama administration. And President Obama really wanted to do something about immigration. And so he created this idea called the Dreamers, or DACA. Okay. And what DACA said is children, dependents of undocumented people who came to the country and they were under 18 and were brought here by their parents, they would create a special subset for them, and they could register with the government, and they would be knocked down to low level priority for deportation, and they could work and go to college, and they couldn't have a criminal background. And he wanted them to register with the government. So this was the creation through an executive order of this whole process. Okay, it was not done through a statute. A statute is what the legislative bodies create by passing laws. It was done through executive order. Now, some members of Congress, Republicans, felt that DACA was unconstitutional, that the president had extended his powers beyond the Constitution, and that those substantial kinds of changes like that needed to be done by passing a statute through the legislative body. So if Congress had had more consensus about this, or had not been so polarized or stuck in gridlock, they could have passed a statute canceling the executive order. But they could not. They didn't have control of both houses, a majority in both houses. So the other thing that can happen with executive orders is someone can sue the president, an interest group, individuals. It has to be someone who has standing in court, who's proved that they've been injured in some way. They'd have to sue the president. It could be local governments, it could be state. And then it'd go through the courts. And that's what happened with Obama's executive order, is it was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. They said that he'd exceeded his authorities. So that is how executive orders work. Okay. Another example under the Trump administration was recently when he did the ban, the Muslim ban of people coming from certain countries he'd identified. And he issued an executive order that people could no longer come from those countries into the United States. That also was some people in Congress thought he had exceeded his authority. That was also adjudicated, though, in the judicial branch, and it was upheld by the judicial branch. So those are some examples of executive orders. When they can be used is when anytime the president wants to do something, but can't get a law passed or a statute, so they can pretty much try anything they want as an executive order, roll it out there, and then just see if their hand gets slapped through checks and balances. And Congress can shut them down with a statute, and the courts can shut them down by declaring it unconstitutional. All right, any other questions? These are good questions. Oh no, my husband is writing a question. All right, the War Powers Resolution. Oh no, thank you.
Can you talk?
Yeah.
Also, it's good pizza. So we're gonna get pizza.
Okay. Huh? Okay, it's kind of you to get a veggie on it. Good job.
Yeah, can you veggie? I'm gonna get a veggie.
Yeah, that's fine.
How long is it?
Cool. We're getting pizza. 20 more minutes.
Students?
Yes, would you like to say hello?
Hi, students. You guys are really hardcore.
Yeah, they're good, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're very dedicated. Here to spring break. Look at them. All their questions. Very impressive. You wouldn't know much about this. I don't think you did this in high school.
Sure. I'm going to break the down.
Okay.
And I'll bring back.
Okay.
So, veggie. I mean, really good veggie pizza.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right. War Powers Resolution. Okay. So, in the Constitution, it says that the Congress declares war, and the president is commander-in-chief. He carries out the war. Well, starting in the 1900s, 1950, Korean War and Vietnam, we started to realize, oh, the president can actually wage the war, send the troops, run the whole operation without the war ever being declared. And so the Korean War, for example, we never declared war. And in the Vietnam War, we never declared war. In some cases, this wasn't the president like being disobedient to Congress. Like Congress didn't want the blood on their hands kind of thing. Like they just forewent the opportunity to actually declare the war. Sorry about that. Okay. But after Vietnam, we have some regret about this, and we think that maybe we do need to go back to the original vision of the founders, which was that the Congress does need to weigh in for war to be waged. So the War Powers Act, a resolution. Let's just remember what a resolution is. It is like a declaration by the Congress about a subject. Okay. It's literally like they resolve that it should be this way. Or so there's resolutions and there's statutes. Okay. This resolution is just like a declaration that it should be this way. And then the question is, would the president uphold that now that the Congress has declared they want it to be that way? Okay. And the way they want it to be is that the president can deploy troops, but he has to let Congress know within 48 hours. And then after 60 days, if the Congress has not approved the deployment of those troops, that they have to bring them back. Okay. So now for the president to deploy troops into a foreign land in armed conflict, they have to get this approval by Congress within a certain number of days. We do not know if the War Powers Act or resolution is actually constitutional. A lot of constitutional scholars think not, but we've never had a president who has not abided by that declaration that the Congress has announced. All right, passing a statute and suing the president are ways that executive orders can be overridden. Yes, that's right. So passing a statute that cancels out the executive order or clarifies how the president shall enforce a law or how it should be carried out. So sometimes by giving a statute more specificity, you close some doors about the president having any flexibility in that area. So yes, passing a statute and then the judicial branch declare, yes, someone has to sue about the executive order and say that it's unconstitutional, and then the courts decide that. That's right, Mary Price. All right, any others? Great. All right, so trustee, instructed delegate, and Politico are all about like how an elected official decides what their position is going to be on a proposed law or issue. Okay, and a trustee is someone who has this mindset about that. They think, this bill here, the people have elected me, and they have entrusted me in my judgment, and therefore I'm just going to decide what I think is best. And I am the trustee of the people. The people have entrusted me with this decision-making authority and power. A instructed delegate thinks, I should make my decision to represent my constituents, the people who elected me from my district or my state, and they should instruct me about how I should vote, and I should represent them. So instead of me just using my judgment, I should take a poll or think about their voting behavior or think about the town hall meetings I've been to. In fact, an instructed delegate would hold a lot of town hall meetings and hear from their constituents, and they might conduct a lot of polling to survey their constituents and then vote the way their constituents want them to vote, even if they think their constituents might be wrong. Okay, so a trustee does not consult their constituents. They kind of let their own conscience guide them. An instructed delegate does let their constituents guide them, and they defer to their constituents. A Politico is a more typical modern manifestation of how you make this work, and it's about being savvy about what votes matter. So a Politico, if it's a issue that's like highly detailed, is not on the public radar, no one really knows about it or cares about it, they will vote as a trustee. But if an issue becomes salient, highly salient, which means that they perceive that a whole bunch of people in their district or state know about it, care about it, are paying attention, then in those cases they will take on the instructed delegate perspective and be more thoughtful about voting the way their constituents want them to vote. And that'll make it easier for them to get reelected the next time. So that's the three things. Okay, we have fewer questions, which is good. And we have about 10 minutes anyway that I was going to dedicate to our cause here. Y'all have asked really good questions, so I feel like those of you who are tuning in, hopefully you've gotten some value out of this. So tomorrow we're going to review Unit 3, and that is the judicial branch and the bureaucracy. I'm going to be on at 3 p.m., and we're also going to look at FRQ 3. Okay? So that's what you need to do between now and then is review Unit 3. Okay, the judiciary, the bureaucracy, and FRQ 3, which is about Supreme Court case comparisons. Okay, then our next review session will be next Sunday, and I'm speaking really slowly. I know the one on the 5th I need to move up because I now have a meeting that night, that Sunday night. So Sunday night the 5th, the night before the exam. Okay, I am going to move our review session up. That's probably good anyway. So we'll do that earlier in the day. You can ask a bunch of questions, and then we won't stay up too late cramming, I hope. Okay, so I just want to get that on your radar that I am going to make that little change on the 5th. But tomorrow is at 3. Okay. And I'll give y'all like another minute or so to pose any other questions you want me to talk about. And if you don't have any, then we will end this session. It should post on YouTube. I didn't think it was going to last time, but in the end it did. I'm not sure how helpful this is. Remember, there's also the hour-long YouTube video I've made before on Unit 2 on my YouTube channel. You have a review book. Remember, there's the College Board website is very helpful. It has a like released sample exam up, I believe. So there's lots of resources. There are also really good resources online, like the crash course, cram for the exam videos. So it kind of depends on what your learning style is, what you find most helpful. There's a lot of Quizlets out there as well. So, and you might be someone who can access Quizlets that are already made, and that's helpful. You might be someone who needs to make Quizlets for the world, and that could be a great gift as well. So, it's a great time to be a student. So many resources. Okay. With 9 minutes to spare, I'm going to let you guys go. And if you run across, the good thing about us doing this again tomorrow at 3 is if you run across anything that you want me to cover tomorrow, I'll be happy to do that. Okay. I'll be in my classroom tomorrow. It's actually a teacher work day. You're not going to be at school though. So enjoy your last day of break. And I hope that while this hasn't been entirely fun, that you feel like it's helped you get ready for the exam. Okay. So you can do as well as you can. And I will see you tomorrow at 3. Okay. So long.